was the night of January 8, 1945, and the men of Cabanatuan prison camp gazed at a strange red glow pulsing along the northwestern horizon. The light rippled and flared like an aurora, but this was no storm over Lingayen Gulf. The American Navy was pounding Luzon with a massive bombardment. Tommy Thomas, the camp's provost marshal, stood shirtless and barefoot, watching from the dark compound. When a naval expert told him the glow was star shells lighting the invasion beaches, a wild hope surged through him. But hope came wrapped in dread. The prisoners knew that as MacArthur's army drew closer, their Japanese captors might decide to eliminate them. The radio hidden in camp had already carried news of the Palawan massacre weeks earlier, where 141 American prisoners were burned or shot to death. Many at Cabanatuan felt they would be next. On the night of January 9th, the commandant summoned Colonel James Duckworth and Adjutant Ralph Hibbs to his office. "We leave in 2 days," the commandant said. "No guards will remain here. If anybody tries to escape, we kill everyone severely." When the Japanese marched out, the prisoners were stunned to find themselves alone. At first light, Duckworth sent Tommy Thomas to scout the fence line. The Japanese had indeed gone, leaving behind a warehouse packed with food. That night, men raided the stores by moonlight, hauling out canned milk, sacks of rice and sugar. Ralph Hibbs broke open a can of condensed milk and drank. The richness sickened him. The next morning, they snared a Brahma cow from the fields and butchered it for a feast. For the first time in years, the prisoners ate their fill. They put on weight as much as a pound a day. Atrophied bodies began to stir. Men who had weighed 90 pounds climbed back above 100. Some even shaved and talked of women. For a brief stretch in mid-January, the men of Cabanatuan allowed themselves to believe the nightmare might be ending. But the dream shattered by late January. New Japanese troops arrived by the hundreds, backed by tanks. They reoccupied the guard towers and sandbagged pillboxes, returning to a 24-hour watch. The prisoners were prisoners again. Across the fence, the soldiers seemed restless and desperate. Many had just come from the front, shell-shocked and bandaged. They cooked their meals at dusk and stamped out their fires in fear of American air raids. The camp swelled with chaotic traffic. Stories seeped in from Cabanatuan City through the bamboo telegraph. A common rumor spread. The Japanese planned to run tanks through the camp and mow down every American. The prisoners felt the old fear tightening around them. Dr. Ralph Hibbs studied the new commandant across a table and thought he saw a man resigning himself to die in a foreign land. Bob Body heard the tank rumors and decided he would not be there when they came. On the morning of January 29th, he convinced 2 other prisoners to escape at nightfall. They would wait until the tower guard went to urinate, then slip through the fence and head north toward the American lines. But that evening, a long convoy of Japanese trucks and tanks rumbled past the camp, moving northeast into the mountains. The noise and confusion lasted until dawn, stamping out their plans. Bob Body and his Confederates shook their heads at their bad timing. They promised to try again tomorrow. They did not know that the next afternoon a column of 121 Rangers would cross the Pampanga River and creep toward them through the darkness. The race was on. Once across, the Rangers emerged into a field of Kogan grass. Mucci moved up and down the columns, slapping backs and offering encouragement. He had a forceful voice that got things done without bellowing. Beside him, Captain Robert Prince, the commander of Company C, grimaced from the pain of blistered feet but was inspired by Mucci's energy. The guerrilla captains, Juan Pajota and Eduardo Choson, split off with their men. Pajota's force headed northeast toward the Cabu River Bridge. Choson's men took position southwest, blocking the road toward Cabanatuan City. Both groups carried orders to hold the highway at all costs. After a half-mile of tall grass, the Rangers reached open rice paddies. The camp of Cabanatuan lay before them, a sprawl of thatch and barbed wire shimmering in the heat. Mucci and Prince studied the terrain with worried faces. The ground was flat and exposed with no cover for a half-mile. If the guards saw them, the mission would fail. Prince gave the signal, and the men fell to their bellies. They began to crawl, pulling themselves through the dry rice stalks, their rifles strapped to their backs. Dikes 2 feet high divided the paddies, and each time the Rangers climbed over one, they were silhouetted against the sky. Then came a sound from the northwest, the low hum of an approaching aircraft. It grew louder, and soon a plane shot over the camp at low altitude. It was a P-61 Black Widow, painted matte black with twin tails and a bulbous nose housing radar equipment. The plane's name was painted on the side, hard to get. Pilot Kenneth Schreiber had been sent to create a diversion. He banked low over the camp, feigning engine trouble, then circled back. The Japanese guard scrambled for cover, then stood staring upward, mesmerized. For 20 minutes, Schreiber performed his taunting dance in the twilit sky. The Rangers used the distraction to crawl forward, covering precious ground while every Japanese eye was fixed on the strange black plane above. A bell began to ring from inside the camp, loud and insistent. Mucci and Prince traded glances of panic. Dozens of Rangers reached for their rifles and unfastened safety switches. The men hissed at each other across the field. "Hell is that? Think they spotted us." But the bell kept ringing and no alarm followed. The guards in the towers appeared calm. The bell was simply the Navy watch bell rung by a prisoner timekeeper, a false alarm. The Rangers exhaled and resumed their crawl. Prince checked his watch. 6:40 p.m. dusk was settling fast, with a blood-orange sun half sunk in the mountains. They were less than a half-mile from the gate. On the eastern side of the camp, Lieutenant John Murphy led 30 Rangers from F Company across the main highway and through a culvert. They emerged in a dry wash that ran along the camp's eastern fence. The ditch was deep enough to conceal them for the first 100 yards, then it grew shallow. Murphy could see a guard tower and 2 pillboxes ahead, manned by Japanese sentries. The Rangers pressed themselves against the bank, stealing peeks over the rim. One guard seemed to sense something. He clutched his rifle and trained it nervously toward the ravine. The men froze. Minutes passed. Finally, the guard relaxed, convinced it was nothing. Murphy's group crept on, past unmarked graves of executed Americans, until they reached the rear of the camp. Through the open windows of a large Nipa barracks, they saw Japanese soldiers lounging in their underwear, smoking and laughing. Murphy raised his M1 rifle and settled his sights on a soldier inside. It was 7:40 p.m. He was ready to fire the first shot. Inside Cabanatuan, the evening of January 30th began like any other. Tommy Thomas donned his provost marshal armband and set out to patrol the fence line. In the medical quarters, Ralph Hibbs sat with 2 fellow doctors, talking quietly under the stars. A phonograph scratched out the old tune, "Wait Till the Sun Shines, Nellie," its tinny melody drifting through the barracks. The sound was thin and worn, a relic from a Red Cross package 2 years old. Bob Body huddled with his 2 Confederates near the southern fence. Their plan was set. At 8:30 they would slip through the wire and make a run for the American lines. Body checked the highway again and saw no traffic. He felt a grim certainty that this was his last night in camp, one way or another. Around them, the Japanese guards chattered in their towers, unaware of the danger closing in. At precisely 7:40, a single rifle shot cracked from the rear of the compound. It was Lieutenant John Murphy firing the signal. In the same instant, the entire fence line erupted in a hurricane of gunfire. Every guard tower and pillbox was raked by concentrated fire from 100 American weapons. The assault was so sudden and devastating that the Japanese guards in the towers and pillboxes were obliterated before they could return a single shot. Inside the camp, the phonograph needle jumped and skidded across the groove. Prisoners hurled themselves into ditches and under barracks, certain the long-dreaded massacre had begun. Hibbs and his colleagues dove into an irrigation trench as bullets whined overhead. Bob Body flattened himself against the ground, his escape plan forgotten. "This is it," he thought. "They're finally killing us all." Teddy Richardson leapt from the ditch and bounded across the road. He swung the butt of his Tommy gun against the padlock on the front gate, but the metal held. Drawing his .45 pistol, he fired a single shot, and the lock clicked open. Richardson flung the hasp aside and threw open the ponderous gates of Cabanatuan. The Rangers poured through the breach, scrambling to their assigned positions inside the compound. Leland Provencher, a heavy automatic rifleman from Minnesota, raced through the gate with his weapon set to automatic. He raked the Japanese officer barracks with sustained fire, the flimsy Nipa walls disintegrating under 550 rounds per minute. A figure emerged from a utility shed, calling out in English. Provencher nearly cut him down before realizing the man was an American engineer, pressed into labor by the Japanese. He ordered the terrified prisoner toward the main gate and moved on. Burt Bank was sure it was a trick, until the ranger told him he was from Oklahoma. "Oklahoma's good enough for me," Banks said. "AB." Abraham rose with his club, refusing to be carried. "I walked out of Bataan, and by God I can walk out of here." John Cook argued he was not a Yank because no Yank wore a uniform like that. A Ranger near bayoneted Alvy Robbins in the confusion. Each prisoner had to be convinced and sometimes physically carried before they understood they were free. Colonel James Duckworth, the American commanding officer, stormed through the compound demanding explanations. He insisted the Japanese had ordered no escapes and that the Rangers would get everyone killed. One Ranger grabbed him by the arm and said that General MacArthur was in charge now. Still grousing, Duckworth shambled out the American gate, and in the darkness he fell into a ditch, fracturing his right arm. Staff Sergeant Manton Stewart crouched in the gravel with his bazooka. He spotted a long-bed truck packed with Japanese soldiers, its driver frantically trying to flee the compound. Stewart squeezed the trigger and the self-propelled rocket fizzed across the camp, piercing the engine block. The truck erupted in flames, and several dozen men crawled half alive from the wreckage before Ranger gunfire finished them. Stewart turned his attention to the corrugated metal sheds that intelligence reports indicated housed Japanese tanks. He fired again, and the thin-skinned structures collapsed in billowing flames. With the threat of armored vehicles eliminated, the Rangers could focus entirely on evacuating the prisoners. The entire assault had taken less than 30 seconds to neutralize every guard tower and pillbox along the fence line. As the first prisoners began to emerge through the gate, a Japanese soldier scrambled into a shallow ditch at the rear of the camp. He set up a knee mortar, quickly estimating the range at 600 yards. He dropped a round into the muzzle, and the projectile arced high over the compound, landing near the front gate in a ragged explosion. Captain Jim Fisher, the battalion surgeon, had been treating wounded near the gate when the mortar shells struck. A large shard of hot shrapnel tore into his abdomen, hurling him into a roadside ditch. Medic John Nelson ran to his aid, only to realize the wounded man was Fisher himself. The captain's wound was severe, with blood hemorrhaging from his liver, and he faded in and out of consciousness as his men carried him toward the Platero schoolhouse. Fisher was placed on a makeshift operating table fashioned from pushed-together desks. Dr. Carlos Leug made a long incision across the belly and discovered the damage was catastrophic. The liver was hemorrhaging, and shrapnel had perforated the colon and small intestines. Without proper anesthetic, Leug worked through the night, picking out bits of metal. At one point, Fisher regained consciousness long enough to ask if all the prisoners had been rescued. Told that they had, he smiled weakly and drifted off again. At the Kabu River Bridge, Captain Juan Pajota watched his trap spring perfectly. The time bomb secreted beneath the span detonated on schedule, tearing a gaping crater through the wooden structure. Japanese tanks and armored vehicles were blocked from crossing, but foot soldiers could still pick their way around the fissure. They tried, and Pajota's men spread in a great V formation athwart the highway, cut them down with enfilading fire. The Japanese commander, Tomio Oyabu, responded by sending wave after wave of soldiers across the bridge. Each squad raised spirited battle cries before meeting certain death from the concentrated guerrilla fire. A truck loaded with troops rushed toward the span, but a Filipino bazooka man struck it with a rocket, and the vehicle erupted in flames. The Japanese kept coming, their bodies piling 3 deep on the bridge, and Pajota's men kept firing. The guerrillas held the bridge for more than half an hour, preventing any Japanese reinforcements from reaching the camp. Pajota's scouts had cut the telephone lines, so the garrison in Cabanatuan City remained unaware of the raid. By the time the shooting at the bridge began to subside, the prisoners were already streaming out of the camp and heading for the Pampanga River. Pajota had given the Rangers the time they needed. At the river, a dozen carabao carts waited in the moonlight, their great yoked oxen stamping along the muddy margins. The most incapacitated prisoners were loaded into the straw-lined wagons, 5 to a cart, and the drivers prodded their animals across the channel. The water came up only to the wagon axles, and the creaky procession crawled north toward Platero, while the able-bodied waited alongside. Captain Prince stood at the front gate, satisfied that every prisoner had been evacuated. He fired a red flare into the sky, the signal for all Rangers to withdraw. As he strode across the rice paddies toward the river, he believed he was the last American to leave Cabanatuan. But one man remained, Edwin Rose, a deaf Englishman who had been sitting at the latrine throughout the entire raid, unaware of the firestorm around him. When he finally emerged, he found the camp silent and empty, and he lay down on his straw mat to sleep. Beyond the eastern fence, Francis Shilley and the remaining F Company men were making their way toward the river when a single rifle shot cracked in the darkness. Corporal Roy Sweezy fell with 2 gaping bullet wounds in his chest. Sergeant Charles Brown emerged from the shadows, his face white with shock, having mistaken Sweezy for a Japanese soldier in the confusion. Sweezy looked into Shilley's eyes and whispered that he had been killed by his own men, and no one could convince him otherwise. Shilley baptized his friend with canteen water, and they left him where he fell, promising that the guerrillas would recover his body at dawn. Captain Jim Fisher died at dawn on January 31st. He had been carried on a Spanish door to the barrio of Balancaran, where Dr. Merle Musselman attempted a vein-to-vein blood transfusion with a scout who shared his blood type. It was futile. Fisher roused for one brief moment, told his friend John Nelson good luck, and then closed his eyes. Chaplain Hugh Kennedy performed the burial service at the base of a fruit tree. The same morning, Filipino guerrillas found Edwin Rose inside the abandoned camp, shaved and dressed in his best clothes, waiting calmly for liberation. He had slept through the entire raid in the latrine and never heard a single shot. The former prisoners gathered strength at an evacuation hospital in Guimba. They received hot showers, fresh clothes, and their first real meals in 3 years. General MacArthur visited the ward, wept at the sight of his old corps, and told Colonel James Duckworth that he was sorry it had taken so long. Within 2 weeks, most of the men were strong enough to travel. They boarded a 13,000-ton troop transport called the USS General Anderson in Leyte Harbor, bound for San Francisco. The voyage would cover nearly 12,000 miles to avoid Japanese submarines, and the ship kept a constant blackout watch. Before the Anderson cleared Philippine waters, Tokyo Rose broadcast a specific threat over the radio. She named the ship, described its cargo of freed prisoners, and announced that Japanese submarines and planes had been ordered to destroy it. The captain told the men to wear life preservers at all times. The vessel zigzagged south toward the equator, then east toward Mexico, stopping for nothing. At one point, a life raft was spotted off the bow, but the skipper refused to slow down, knowing the Japanese sometimes rigged decoys to lure American ships into range. On the morning of March 8th, a cold fog enveloped the California coast. The Anderson had stopped tacking and was driving straight in at flank speed. Then a vent opened in the mist, and the men saw the Golden Gate Bridge only a few hundred yards ahead, its span filled with thousands of tiny figures waving handkerchiefs and screaming from the rails. A banner on the rail said, "God bless you, ex-Pavs." Flowers, money, and bits of lingerie rained down on the deck as the ship passed beneath the bridge. The Anderson pulled into Pier 15 at the Embarcadero, where a brass band played air raid sirens, keened, and fireboats shot froth hundreds of feet into the air. A water taxi pulled alongside bearing a sign that said, "Welcome home," in letters 6 feet high. President Roosevelt broadcast a message over the loudspeakers, greeting the men and telling them each would receive a hand-signed letter from the White House. Bob Boddy remembered that there was not a dry eye on the ship. The men stepped off the ramp and kissed the ground, then stood dumb and dazed as strangers embraced them and pressed notes with telephone numbers into their hands. Colonel Henry Mucci and Captain Robert Prince each received the Distinguished Service Cross, MacArthur calling the raid the most personally satisfying event of the campaign. Mucci returned to Connecticut as a national hero and later worked for an oil company in Bangkok. Prince went into the fruit business in Washington state. Dr. Ralph Hibbs moved to Oregon, ran a clinic, and died in October 2000. Tommy Thomas built the house he had dreamed about in prison, became a Methodist minister, and retired in Arizona. Bob Boddy settled in Florida. Burt Bank returned to Alabama, entered the state legislature, and ran a successful radio station. A.B. Abraham remained in the Philippines for 2 years recovering American dead, then returned to Pennsylvania. Juan Pajota moved to America and died of a heart attack in 1976. Eduardo Chosin became governor of Nueva Ecija. General Masaharu Homa was convicted for the Bataan Death March and executed by firing squad in 1946. The site of Cabanatuan Camp is now a modest park, a memorial wall listing the names of 2,656 Americans who died there. The lasting image is not the cheering crowds or the brass band. It is a single moment from that night in Platero when Captain Fisher came out of the fog of his morphine and asked if they had gotten them all, told that every prisoner was out. He smiled weakly and drifted off. If you have any personal stories, family memories, or historical anecdotes from the Pacific Campaign or the prison camps of World War II, We would be grateful if you shared them in the comments below. We read every one. Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to support our future historical documentaries. Thank you for listening and for keeping these stories alive.